Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible class. How long was the nation of Israel in Egypt? We're all pretty familiar with the story of the Exodus and the Israelites going down into Egypt and being enslaved, and Moses leading them out at Passover and taking them to Mount Sinai. But how long were they down there for? How long were they actually in Egypt? Now, I know most people would quickly say 400 years. Everyone knows that the Israelites spent 400 years in Egypt, but did they? Is that what the Bible actually says? Or is that just what people say that the Bible says? You see, in Galatians 3:17, Paul is comparing the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant that God made with Abraham, with the covenant that God made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai. And he says that the Mount Sinai covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, came into effect 430 years after the covenant that God made with Abraham. That is a huge time detail, and it is going to be our launching point to figure out how long were the Israelites in Egypt. So if you were to timeline this all out, we have Mount Sinai on one side, and we'll have the promise that God made to Abraham on the other. Now, according to Galatians 3:17, those are 430 years apart. But now it requires a little bit of detective work to figure out exactly which pieces fit between those two events. Now, that promise that God made with Abraham, we get that covenant in Genesis 15. And the only time detail we have about Abraham's age around that time is that he was 75 years old back in Genesis 12. So many people assume that Genesis 15 took place very shortly thereafter and say that Abraham was 75 years old at the time that he made the covenant of the parts in Genesis 15. So if Abraham is 75 years old then, and God tells him specifically that his descendants would be strangers in a land that is not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. Well, this gives us another major time marker. At some point in the future, an event was going to happen that was going to kick off the Israelites' enslavement. It was going to last for 400 years, hence why most people say that they were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, because, well, it's right there in Genesis 15. But if Paul is right in Galatians 3, then I don't know that they can be in Egypt that entire time. They don't go down to Egypt 30 years after Genesis 15. But there must have been some sort of an inciting event 30 years later. So what did happen 30 years after God made this promise with Abraham? Well, we don't know exactly. But 25 years after this promise, Abraham's son, the son of promise, Isaac, was born. And this happens when Abraham is 100 years old. But that's not quite enough time. Something needs to take place about 5 years after that, and it needs to be bad. So the only place we can really draw out of the text where this might begin would be when Isaac is mocked by his older brother Ishmael. It says in the text that the mocking of Isaac happened when he was weaned. Now, we don't know exactly how old that is, but we'll speculate that he was 5 years old when his brother Ishmael mocked him. And that is the launching point for the 400 years of oppression. So if that happens when Isaac is 5 years old, 55 years after that, when Isaac is 60, that's when his son Jacob is born. And Jacob is the key to figuring all of this out, because Jacob and his family are the ones that are actually going to go down to Egypt. But how old was Jacob when that happened? Well, in Genesis 46, when Jacob first comes down to Egypt to be reunited with his son Joseph, he stands before Pharaoh and tells Pharaoh that he is 130 years old. And this is the last piece of the puzzle that we need to figure this all out. How long was it from when Jacob came down to Egypt with his family until the Israelites came out and go to Mount Sinai? Well, if we use some simple math, if Jacob was 130 when he came down, and 55 years before he was born, Isaac was mocked, and 30 years before that, God made a promise to Abraham, then that means that there were only 215 years left. So the Israelites, from the time that Jacob and his family came down to Egypt until when Moses leads the people out at Passover, according to the Bible, appears to be 215 years, not 400 like everybody says. Now, That's 215 years total that the Israelites were in Egypt. When they first come down, Joseph is still alive. He was still second in command of all of Egypt. The Israelites were in good standing with the Egyptians at first. That wasn't the beginning of the slavery and harsh bondage. That was just the Israelites going down into Egypt. Well, we don't know exactly when the actual enslavement part started. We know that it wasn't the entire 215 years. But at some point, a pharaoh did arise that did not remember Joseph and who enslaved the Israelites and oppressed them with forced labor. And that same pharaoh was the one who was having the Israelite babies killed just 80 years before Moses led the Israelites out. So while they weren't actually slaves for the entire 215 years, it's safe to say that at least the last 100 years or so were not good for the Israelites. But why does any of this matter? What's the difference if they were enslaved in Egypt for 215 years or 210 years or 400 years? Who cares? Well, as avid studiers of our Bibles and as people who have devoted our lives to the service of Jesus Christ, it does a massive disservice to the text to say things about it that are factually incorrect. So here at Bible Class, we find it fun and exciting to dig into the text and find out what it really has to say. There are so many of these common misconceptions out there, and many of them aren't major theological or doctrinal issues, but I still think that it's important that we do our best to present ourselves to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who accurately handles the word of truth.